And we're back.
I'm Ian.
I'm Steve.
So today we're going to tell you about being a good player.
This is ground that has been trodden before, but it deserves to be trodden again, especially because we talked a lot to the GMs last time.
Mm-hmm. So I'm going to borrow a couple of terms from Matt McFarland, a great RPG developer who I've worked for in the past. He wrote some essays about what makes a beautiful player, and I'm going to focus on three of the things he identified, which he termed consciousness, appearance, and initiative. These make a good social player because the player is paying attention during game, is paying attention to the things which have to come together logistically to make the game happen, and is making things happen at the gaming table for the good of the game. Those are the broad categories. Let's unpack. Starting with consciousness.
Yep.
So, at the gaming table, you could have three different players. They all have different problems of consciousness. Player 1 is tired and keeps nodding off.
This is a literal problem of consciousness. He is an unconscious player, and as such, not only doesn't contribute to the game, but probably snores as well.
Player 2 is on her phone or her laptop doing something else and always has to be reminded what was actually going on in the game when she's called on.
This player's consciousness is altered in some way. It's not necessarily the same as being on drugs, but let's face it, it's kind of like drugs for the brain because you are so distracted you don't know what ooh shining.
And player 3 is in a side role play with player 4, and neither of them are paying any attention to anybody except each other.
And before you know it, in the middle of combat, they've gone on a date, gotten married, had 2 in-game kids, and then the GM asks, what's your initiative again? And they're like, oh, it's that year still? I thought we were 5 years down the road. Actual thing that happened in the game I was running.
It is a little bit extreme of an example, but the same sort of thing can happen in various types of scenes, and all of these things represent players who are not paying attention to the rest of the flow of the game in some way, and so they are not meeting their social obligations to the rest of the group.
Be conscious. You are here to play as part of the group. Everyone else is putting their effort into it. You owe yourself, I'm not even talking about owing the other people, you literally owe yourself the effort to be awake, aware, and conscious of what is going on. If you cannot manage that, take care of that problem first. If you are too tired to stay at game, excuse yourself and take a nap. If you absolutely have to make contact with someone on the phone, excuse yourself and take care of that. If you really absolutely need to resolve something between characters, take time to do that before or after a game session, because that is not why you are here.
So, part 2 is appearance.
And we do partly mean the physical appearance, although we're not going to judge anyone based on their various appearances.
We already covered some of the basic hygiene sorts of things,
Yeah.
but this is where we reiterate the scheduling and communication from the player side and get into a couple of more specific examples.
For instance, in addition to scheduling and preparation, there's also supplies. Have the stuff you need. Do you need pencils, notebooks, papers, miniatures, dice? It is your responsibility as a player to arrange the things you need before the game. You don't necessarily have to own the things you need. Perhaps you are borrowing a rulebook from a friend, but it is not the GM's responsibility or another person who sat down next to you's responsibility to have a freshly sharpened pencil and a painted miniature. If those are required, that is your responsibility.
And beyond the required, there are things that are nice to have that players should think about helping provide. Food, drink, rides for players besides themselves. And in addition to all of this, the player should consider the schedule of the game as a whole. You know in advance when the game session is going to happen, presumably, because the GM should also be on top of scheduling. We covered that in our introduction to the whole be a good GM, be a good player topic. But once the schedule is being discussed, you, as the player, will be faced with choices. Do you go with the game session that's going to be scheduled that night?
That you know is going to be scheduled that night.
Or do you tell the players and GM in your group, I'm going to be at this baby shower for my third cousin instead. And we can't tell you which you should do.
Yes.
But you should be aware that when you make the choice to choose one social obligation over another, you are sending messages to both of those social groups about how important they are to you.
We can also say two other things besides that. The first is, when you make these choices, make them in advance. Do not tell your game master the day of, oh, I have to be at my cousin's wedding today. Tell him when you RSVP to the wedding and remind him in advance.
You should probably be RSVPing to the wedding in advance.
Do not tell your fellow player, hey, I'm afraid I can't pick you up for game today. I have to go to a piano recital that I'm playing at. Don't tell her that at the day of. Tell her a couple of days before so she can arrange a ride. So that's the first thing, is make sure that any communication of this sort happens well in advance, unless it's an emergency.
Furthermore, final note on the subject of appearance is, when you make these decisions, bear in mind how you have made these decisions in the past and how that is adding up for your relationship with this game and this gaming group. If you consistently throw over the game for other things that come up, it is going to create a bad appearance, an appearance of you caring more about any little thing that comes up. Even if those things are big in your life, they are not part of the life of the other people in the gaming group.
At one point, I had a policy that if a friend from more than 2 hours out of town was in town and needed to hang out or needed a pickup from the airport, I would do that over games. When I had 2 friends that I knew who were intercontinental or out of state, this was a rare occurrence. These days, practically everyone in my contacts book is over 6 hours away by car. I no longer have that policy. They are instead invited to games, because if I had the policy of they come first, I would be missing games as they pass through my hometown. All the time.
So, while there are circumstances that you can't control, like you got scheduled for work, you should simply communicate about those, there are also circumstances you can control, and you should think about those. We're going to talk about the final thing in a separate video, because we've already gone quite long on these two subjects.
And it's a pretty big subject.
So, join us next time for more about being a good social player. Thanks for sticking with us so far.